Welcome to the Jones Gallery Lecture Series. I'm Sarah Jones, the curator here at Jones Gallery. We are a contemporary art gallery based in St. John, New Brunswick, Canada, and our mandate is to present work by contemporary Canadian artists. But art history is also important to us, and we're on a grand mission to make art history accessible, understandable, and free. So this lecture series is supported by our viewers, and today's video is brought to you by Trudy, Lisa, Frank, David, and Carla. Thank you very much for supporting us and our efforts. If you would like to join them in donating to the lecture series, you can do so at jonesgallery.ca/arthistory. Today's video is called Leonardo Goes to Milan, and I'll be talking about the period of time that Leonardo spends in the northern Italian town between the years 1482, 83 or so to 1499. And this period of time is interesting in all kinds of from all kinds of perspectives, but it's interesting because Leonardo was ostensibly a Florentine, so he was from the town of Vinci, Leonardo da Vinci, of course, which is a town just outside of Florence. And typically Florentines stayed in Florence. They loved Florence and wanted to. There's a great sense of kind of civic pride and honor. And Leonardo, he kind of balks at a lot of the kind of normal traditions. Like he wasn't a very religious man. He wasn't kind of bound in by these civic expectations, and he leaves his what is essentially his hometown. He leaves Florence around, like I said, 1482, 83, to go to work in the court of Ludovico Sforza, the Duke of Milan. He's also known as Ludovico il Moro, Ludovico the Moor. And we're not exactly sure why he leaves Florence. He might have been sent by Lorenzo de Medici to kind of as a gesture to Ludovico Sforza. But probably most likely is that he was leaving Florence simply for economic reasons or for a greater chance of kind of employment opportunity, probably in Milan. Milan was a bigger city, much larger than Florence. The population was much larger at the time. We do have a wonderful, wonderful letter that Leonardo wrote to this gentleman, to Ludovico Sforza, in the early 1480s. And it's essentially an employment pitch. And in this letter, you can find this online. Just search for Leonardo's letter to Ludovico. And it's really a delight to read. I really recommend it. But basically, he spends the 95% of the letter explaining how good he is at creating war machines. And I'll go back while I'm reading this. I'll put you on the... So this is Leonardo here, what we kind of know of him. This is he's older in this portrait than he probably was in Milan. He was in his early 30s when he went to Milan, but this is kind of how we, and when he finished up in Milan, he would have been in his late 40s, 50s, so he would kind of look like this, roughly. All right, back to the letter. So he's essentially pitching to Ludovico, I'm really good at making bridges, I'm really good at kind of preparing a city against siege attack, I'm really good at removing water from moats and designing moats. I can make really good ladders and kind of scaling instruments to break a siege. He has lots of methods for destroying fortresses or any kind of stranglehold that's been founded upon rock and so forth. He can make cannons. He's really good at making small portable cannons with great design. He can design mines and secret winding passages under the encampments of the enemies. He can also make tanks if you need them, so covered vehicles, safe and unassailable, which can penetrate the enemy and their artillery. He repeats that he can make cannon and mortar and light ordnance of very beautiful and functional design. He can do catapults, trebuchets, and if there's the occasion of a sea battle, he's really good at designing anything that one would need to embark on a sea battle. Then at the very end of the letter, it's so interesting because at the end, Leonardo says, and if there's peacetime and you want me to do sculpture or painting, I'm also really, really good at that. I can execute sculpture in marble, bronze, and clay. So ding, ding, ding. Likewise in painting, I can do everything possible as well as any other, whoever he may be. So I am the best artist you can find in Italy. Ludovico, you should hire me. So he does. He spends almost, like I said, 17 years in the court of Ludovico Sforza. He leaves in 1499 and goes back, kind of in a meandering way, back to Florence. It kind of coincides with the end of the controlled power that Ludovico has in Milan. Part of what he spends, this is so disappointing to talk about, but I'll tell you anyway. He spends a great deal of his time in the early years constructing and working on a grand equestrian sculpture for Ludovico Sforza. It was intended to be dedicated to Ludovico's father, and it was part of Leonardo's pitch, like, hey, hire me to come to your court and we'll make this big equestrian monument. And equestrian monuments were seen as kind of the ultimate kind of artistic expression, kind of the ultimate monument that a patron and an artist can create. Artists and patrons of the Renaissance were looking back to this sculpture in particular, the bronze equestrian monument of Marcus Aurelius. It's enormous. It's made out of bronze. It was in the center of Rome. Now it's in the Capitoline Museums. I mean, who doesn't want to be shown on a horse like this? Power. It's also, bronze is really difficult. It's kind of seen as the height of artistic achievement. So horses are hard to depict, and bronze is hard to work with. So it's kind of, artistic prowess in its greatest form. We know that Leonardo worked on this. There are a few drawings. The sculpture does not exist. The bronze was requisitioned by Ludovico and made into cannons for some war that he was always at war with. Milan was always at war with Venice, so it might have been for the War with Venice. I forget. But anyway, no equestrian monument exists. It's one of the greatest tragedies of art history, I think, that we don't have this by Leonardo. But we do have some from delightful paintings, one of which I will talk about here. This is Leonardo's Lady with an Ermine, completed in 1489 to 90. So, 6, 7, 8 years into his tenure at the court of Ludovico Sforza. The person sitting for this portrait, her name is Cecilia Gallerani. She was probably a teenager at the time of this portrait, and she was the mistress of Ludovico Sforza. He had a kind of a wandering appetite. He had many mistresses, but we believe that Cecilia was his favorite, and he commissioned Leonardo to do this portrait of her. It's a remarkable portrait, and it kind of foreshadows the masterpiece we all know to come, the Mona Lisa, which is completed some years later, about 20, 30 years later. But like the Mona Lisa, what is so remarkable about Lady with an Ermine is the composition. So you'll notice here that she is in 3/4 profile. So she is turning to the left of the frame, her body, but her head looks past her shoulder and it's looking to the right. So it's very lifelike. There's a great deal of movement in the kind of the structure and the composition of the figure here. And then her pose is also echoed by the ermine. So just keep that in mind. Great deal of movement, innovative compositional structure. This is what was typical for portrait or for portraiture at the time. This is roughly a contemporary of Leonardo da Vinci, Piero della Francesca, and this is typical portraiture. Portraiture was often done in profile, and it appears it's very static. It's very formal. Not a great deal of kind of personality can come through. It feels very staged. And notice too that the sitter is often cropped kind of at mid chest level. We rarely see the hands. If we see the hands are kind of the sitter then will bring them kind of up into the frame. But the composition is typically cut off at the the mid chest. And we see this just with the earlier two portraits that I showed you in this video. So Melzi's version of or portrait of Leonardo is also in profile, and the same thing with this one of Ludovico Sforza himself, once again in profile, and cut off kind of right at bicep level. And compare those to Leonardo's Lady with an Ermine. It's so much more lifelike, and it feels very impromptu almost. We see the full extension of her arms. The composition here is cut off not at chest level, but at her waist. And it's that turning in space, and the way that her head turns on her neck also is remarkable. And instead of looking very statically, directly kind of out to the side of the frame, she's looking past us. So she's obviously making eye contact with someone else. And so we're getting kind of pulled into this feeling of naturalism, or something that this is a very lifelike portrait of a young woman. Again, this is just a kind of foreshadowing, or it's a premonition of what will come later in Leonardo's life. There's a video on the Mona Lisa. I won't talk a lot about Mona Lisa here, but you can watch our other video on that. And just comparing the posture. The Mona Lisa, her head is her gaze is meeting the viewer, whereas Cecilia's is looking off to the right. So there's a little bit more movement in the earlier portrait. But you can see too that the composition is very similar from the waist up. There's no background in the Lady with an Ermine, so it's very dark. It's mostly focused. It's exclusively focused on the figure and the ermine. This is done with oil paint. So there's oil paint kind of on a wood panel. Leonardo was one of the early adopters of oil paint. As part of the Northern Renaissance, they were using oil paint lots in the Northern European countries, and it was slowly filtering down into Italy. And Leonardo was one of the first artists to begin experimenting with oil paint. Oil paint is, you can get all kinds of interesting effects with oil paint. It's very malleable, and it has kind of great resonance. If that makes any sense. Anyway, as a medium, I'll talk more about oil paint at another time. But this is one of his early oil paintings. It allows for great blending and kind of receding of depth of kind of shadow and gradations of color and light and dark. And the inclusion of the ermine has kind of captured our imagination, like since it was unveiled. There's probably a few reasons for the inclusion of the ermine. Her last name, like I said, is Gallerani. In Greek, there can be a little pun on her last name that connects with Ermine. There's also some kind of connection with Ludovico Sforza that his nickname has something to do with an ermine. So here she is kind of holding and cherishing an ermine. So it's like she is cherishing Ludovico Sforza himself. But notice too how the turn in the ermine's body mirrors the turn in Cecilia's body as well. And just as a wee little side note before I conclude today's video, if there are any Philip Pullman fans out there, I read an article once that it was this painting, among a couple others, but this is one of the paintings that inspired Philip Pullman's Dark Materials and the idea of the demon and the connection between the human being and the demon. So anyway, you should hold this painting close to your heart if you are a Philip Pullman fan. Anyway, that's it for today. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll talk to you again soon.